This is Higher Biology, Unit 3.5, Symbiosis. So the last topic was animal welfare, and what we're going on to look at now is relationships between living things. We're going to start off with the term symbiosis and what that means, a symbiotic relationship, and we're going to look over these three sessions at a couple of types of symbiotic relationship. So the first one is parasitism. So you want to be able to describe the relationship between a parasite and its host and how these parasites are transmitted. And then later on, we'll look at what's called mutualism. But we'll start off with the parasites. So symbiosis as a definition is just an intimate relationship between members of different species. So we're not talking about anything that's intra-specific here between members of the same species. We're talking about things which are quite different. And these relationships have co-evolved, so they've developed over many years. So essentially, you can think of the organisms having lived in the same environment, the same ecosystem or habitat for thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years, and this relationship has evolved. And as I said at the start, you've got two types that we're going to look at. So you've got parasitic symbiosis or mutualistic. So symbiosis, just a relationship between members of different species. It has evolved together at the same time, and it's either parasitic or mutualistic. So parasitic to begin with, and just the word parasite, I suppose, doesn't, sounds like it might do you some harm, and there is truth in that. So what happens here in parasitic symbiosis, and we'll look at some examples in a minute, the parasite, it benefits by gaining nutrients or energy from the host, whereas the host is harmed by losing nutrients or energy. So they might not be harmed to the extent that they die, but they will lose something. And also with some parasites, they've got limited metabolism. So this means that they can't carry out particularly complex reactions and they can't survive outside their host. So what you've got down here is the Ebola virus, and viruses, the sort of definition of them as whether they're a living thing or not is kind of up for debate, but essentially they are parasites, and they will, as we know from COVID, they will take control of our cellular machinery in order to make more copies of themselves. And we know as well that if it's, for example, transmission of viruses is more difficult outside because they don't survive very long. So that is a parasite. So a parasite takes energy from its host, but limited metabolism, might not survive outside its host. Now this is how it can be transmitted. So first of all, there's direct contact. So this one here represents head lice. So from person to person, the parasite can be directly transmitted. The second one is a little bit more complex. So this is resistance stages in the life cycle. So what you have here is a tapeworm. So I'll just talk you through this. So we're going to imagine that you have got some contaminated vegetation here. So let's imagine that the tapeworm eggs are within the food which has been eaten by the pig. So what happens is the pig ingests that. Then within the pig, the eggs hatch into larvae, so they're having part of their life cycle within the pig, and then within the muscle tissue you get what's called these cysts, so the larvae is beginning to develop. Then if you have the pig is slaughtered and you're going to have bacon or whatever, or pork, then what happens is if the food isn't cooked properly, then the cysts can survive. Then you have the human eating the contaminated food. Pretty rare, I think, in this country for it to happen, but certainly quite common abroad in the developing world. And then what happens is when that raw food, contaminated raw food, is consumed by the human, then the tapeworm develops when it's within the intestine of the human. So there's the scolex, the head of the tapeworm attaches to the intestine. Once we're back in the classroom, I'll show you a good video. In fact, you could have a wee search about on YouTube, you might find it, But it's a video of a scientist who deliberately infects himself with a or deliberately eats tapeworm larvae in order to see what effect it has on him. So yeah, we'll have a look at that at some point. So just to kind of summarise what I was saying there, so you've got kind of two hosts here. So in the picture we had the pig and the human. So the pig is what's called the secondary host, so it consumes the tapeworm egg. Then within the muscle tissue the eggs hatch and they become larvae. Then what happens is you've got the pig meat, whatever it may be, has now got the larval cysts in it. Human eats it, and then the human becomes the primary host for the tapeworm. So the tapeworm completes its cycle and it becomes adult in the human gut. And yeah, there's kind of if you not that I've ever been had a tapeworm in my gut, but I think there's kind of feelings of discomfort, and then eventually the thing will leave your body. Um, Over a period of time, I think you have to take a wee pill maybe to get rid of it. But yeah, we'll go into that. This is another good one. So, and there's a video that you can watch on YouTube which shows this. So this is called the botfly, and it's found in Central and South America. And what it does is it lays eggs on another insect, usually. So, for example, a mosquito. Then the mosquito deposits the eggs on the animal's skin, so it's getting a lot of other organisms to do its job for it. Then what happens is the egg hatches, and this is the interesting bit. The larvae then burrows into the skin and leaves a little hole for it to breathe, and the larvae feeds on the tissue and blood before it's ready to become adult. So on the next page, there's a YouTube link, and you can search for this on YouTube, and I think it's called botfly removal. And this is one I'm not quite entirely sure how this has happened, but basically, maybe I presume it's when someone's been sleeping, but the um, the larvae is in someone's lip, and you can see the wee breathing hole, and what you see is the operation to, or not an operation, I suppose, but the removal of it. It's either gonna it's you either find it quite satisfying to watch, or it'll make you feel sick. So I'll leave that up to you. But yeah, bot fly removal. So this is the video here. So we've had, for parasitic transmission, we've had the direct contact, so head lice, I suppose corona, if someone was to cough and you were to breathe it in, that you'd classify that as direct contact, or if it was through touch, saliva, or mucus, or whatever. Then we had the life cycle, so the resistant stages, so the tapeworm was an example, and the botfly. And the third one is vectors. So vectors we've encountered before when we looked at recombinant DNA technology, and in that case it was just genetic material which carried genetic material from another living thing. So human genetic material going into bacteria, for example. So this is similar. So a vector is just when another species transfers something. So in the case of this parasitic transmission, what we're looking at is the transfer of the parasite by another species. And the most famous one, and the one that's done most damage around the world, is the Plasmodium parasite, which is malaria. So it's carried by mosquitoes, and they feed off the blood of mammals, including ourselves, and infect mammals with Plasmodium parasite. And just to give you an idea of, this is from a graphic from a few years ago, but deaths caused by various different parasites or bacteria in the last how many years, and you can see we've got flu, the plague, smallpox, TB, a billion, but malaria is the big one. So that parasite transferred by its mosquito vector has caused a billion plus deaths. And I want to spend a bit of time on malaria because it is such a significant parasite in the world. So have a look at this and then have a break, and then we come back next time. We'll look a bit more detail at what happens with Plasmodium, the malaria parasite. So you can search for the Science Bulletin's malaria. So I want to look at malaria again in a minute, but before we do that, let's just refresh our memory. So press pause and answer these questions. So symbiosis is your textbook definition. So these are well done if you get the word co-evolved in there. So co-evolved, intimate relationships between living things. And then there's two types of symbiosis. We've only really talked about parasitism so far, but there is another one, and that is mutualism. And then number three, name and give an example of each type of parasitic transmission. So there was three of them, and they were direct contact, NITs, as would be an example of that. Then you've got the second way of transmitting it as a resistant life cycle stages. So that's your tapeworm, and then finally vectors. And the one we're going to look at now is the Plasmodium parasite, which is transferred via mosquitoes. So mosquitoes, there is one there. So a bit like midges, I suppose, they can sense CO2 that we're breathing out from about 30 meters away. They're also attracted by heat and also movement. And in order for the females, it's the females that bite. In order for them to make their eggs, they require a blood meal, and that is mammals basically. And then what happens is, if you have got someone who's infected with a parasite, we talked about Plasmodium for malaria, but it could be, say, Zika virus is one that was in there was an outbreak relatively recently, and what can happen is the mosquitoes can transfer the infected blood from one individual to another, and transfer the virus or whatever the parasite may be between individuals. And with malaria, as I said before, billions of deaths over over decades, and in terms of annually, at the moment, it's about 400,000 deaths, and sadly, most deaths are children under 5. And the sort of biology of it, the parasite is called Plasmodium, and it evolved in gorillas. So we talked about, you'll know probably from the news that, um, you probably know from the news that you had COVID has probably come from wild animals as well, and similarly with this. So it's parasite evolved in gorillas, and about 50,000 years ago, it's thought that it infected both gorillas and humans. And as we know from these COVID variants, it's subsequently mutated and it's become a specialist in humans. So yeah, it's jumped really from gorillas to us because we're so genetically similar. So have a look at this YouTube film, Key Facts About Malaria. And then here's a little task for you to do. It's not something that's examinable, so this is optional, but it's a good thing to do just to give you, maybe get a bit more established in your head what the ins and outs of parasites are. So if you go to this website or Google your genome malaria challenge, and then if you go through the 5 life cycle stages, it'll kind of take you through it, and you can, while you're doing that, answer the questions which are on the next slide. So if you did that, the number one, what is the name of the Plasmodium parasites which enter human blood via mosquito saliva? So they're called sporozoites. It's a good word. And then 2, which organ does the parasite initially target and what occurs there? So the parasite moves to the liver, and then you've now got the next stage, which is merozoites, and they enter the bloodstream. What does the parasite do in red blood cells? So that's when it develops into its sexual forms, so it can begin to reproduce. And then number 4, where does sexual reproduction of the parasite take place? So that is within the mosquito's stomach. And then describe one way in which genetically modified mosquitoes may prevent malaria. And that is, and this is something which might happen relatively soon, is that if you mutate the mosquito genes that are essential for the mosquito stages of the parasite, then that would mean that the parasite can't survive. Or you could just create mosquitoes that have got genes for transmission blocking antibodies, or you create sterile mosquitoes. So again, just different ways in which you can prevent transmission of the parasite. So last little section of this, so this is from 3 years ago. So start with this. So write notes on parasitic relationships and transmission of parasites. Press pause and see if you've got that. So what you should have for this, first of all, is just a definition. So a parasite is a living thing or an organism which benefits or gains energy from the host, whereas the host is harmed or negatively affected, loses energy, loses nutrients. And then number two is an example. So an example of parasitic relationship. So you could have, say, tapeworm with pig and human, and you could talk a little bit about the taking energy, or you could talk about malaria, mosquitoes, plasmodium parasite here. Any kind of example, but just the benefit and the harm described. Taking blood from a mammal would be the harm, and the benefit is the parasite gains energy. So the parasite, you could also say, often have limited metabolism, so they can't live outside their host. And you can get 2 marks if you say all 3 methods of parasite transmission. So that is direct contact, resistant stages, or vectors. And then finally, you might have mentioned this if you kind of talk through the tapeworm life cycle, but you might say some parasites have a secondary host. In the case of the tapeworm, it's a pig, and that to complete their life cycle, or a description of that. So hopefully you could get 4 out of that. So the last section of this is mutualism. So that was another type of symbiosis. So mutualistic symbiosis is an interdependent relationship between members of different species. And if you think about a parasitic relationship as one in which one species benefits and the other is harmed, then if it's mutualistic, then they both benefit. So there's lots of examples of this. Here's a good one. So in Africa, you have these zebras, and you might have seen this in documentaries that you'll have these birds that will maybe sit on their backs. And the reason why they do this is because you'll have ticks which feed off the blood of the zebras. And what happens is that's a meal for the birds. So the birds get they're using the fact that ticks use zebras to get some food, whereas the zebras benefit because they're having the ticks removed. So that's an example of mutualism. Some other examples, and this is one that's only been sort of discovered recently. So what we've got here is a tree with some roots, and it's been discovered that fungi will grow alongside or within the tree roots. So you can see it down here. So here's the fungi growing beside the tree roots. And the relationship is that what happens is the fungi actually provide the tree with increased surface area. So it means that they can have their nutrients or water entering their roots via the fungi. And then the benefit for the fungi is that they can get some of the energy from photosynthesis. So when the tree or the leaves produce the sugar, then some of it will get passed on to the fungi. So I scratch your back, you scratch mine, and they both benefit. Another good one is this. So this is a termite. So what they can do is, well, you'll maybe know from Nat 5, you have lignin, which carries water found within the stems of plants and trees and so on. And microorganisms in the guts of termites, they can digest the cellulose and the lignin, so it's something that we can't do and a lot of animals can't do. And what that means is the termites gain energy because that is very difficult to gain energy from cellulose and lignin. And meanwhile, the microorganisms, they get a supply of food. So you can almost think of the bacteria just sitting in the gut waiting for the cellulose and the lignin to arrive, for them to get energy, but also they're breaking it down and passing it on to the termites as well. And one of the ones that's one of the maybe the earliest examples of mutualism involves our individual cells. So if you look at this table is from going back to Unit 1. Now, we teach you sort of at Nat 5 level that you find DNA in the nucleus, but it's not strictly true. You also find it in mitochondria and chloroplast, which is a bit peculiar, isn't it? When you think about it, why do you need to have two locations of DNA? And the reason is, I think there's strong evidence for this, is that mitochondria and chloroplasts at one point in time, going back millions, well, billions of years, I would imagine, maybe about a billion years, were separate living things, and they benefited from being inside a larger cell or larger organism. So if we look here, what you have is a basic prokaryote, and then separate to that you have some bacteria which are aerobic, and that's kind of key. So it's thought that what happened was you had this prokaryote which ingested some aerobic bacteria. However, they survived, so they ended up inside the prokaryote basically. And what happened was they ended up producing energy for it. So thinking about mitochondria, they can use that oxygen in respiration to produce energy. And that is what they evolved into. So they eventually became mitochondria, and they couldn't survive outside this prokaryote anymore. Some of them then went on to also ingest cyanobacteria, which were capable of carrying out photosynthesis, and then eventually these became plant cells. So you then have the chloroplasts and the mitochondria within this larger cell. So a good example of mutualism, when these mitochondria and chloroplasts were simple living things in the past, they benefited from the protection of that larger cell, and the larger cell benefited from these complex processes that chloroplasts and mitochondria were able to carry out: photosynthesis and respiration. Okay, watch this. Let's just search for that. Should be the top result: symbiosis. And then to finish off, just a summary of the two of them. So copy that out. I think we've done these before. And then I want you to copy these into the particular section they should be in. So press pause and do that. So what you should have here, so for parasitism, the example is Plasmodium in humans, and one benefits, whereas the other, the host, is harmed. The organism may have limited metabolism, and you can have transmission via direct contact, vectors, or resistance stages. And you can also say this, similar to the one up here. So one gains energy and the other, which is the host, loses energy. There's only one for both, and that is that it's intimate relationship between members of different species. And oh, hang on, there's two. Co-evolved should also be in there. And then for mutualism, you can say that both species benefit. It's an interdependent relationship between members of different species. And an example is the oxpecker bird and zebra.